Welcome back to Oratio Podium. We are again joined on our journey in discussing different experiences for public speaking and debating at different domains. Our guest for today is Manasija. Manasija is a very avid parliamentary debater and has also a lot of other public speaking experience. He has achieved laurels at over 80 plus international and national debate competitions by being also a semi finalist in the Asian level in the British parliamentary debates around the world, as well as an Australasian pre quarter finalist in the Austral format. He's also a two-time Asian Octo finalist in the 3v3 Asian format, while also participating in many prominent national competitions around India, which he has also won and also gone to the finals of. Some notable examples of these include his wins at Nalsar IV and Prem Chand debate, and also being a finalist in competitions such as RCL and IIT Bombay. Manasija currently is an analyst at Bain and Company and also has actively coached his juniors in VIT DepSoc. We are very glad to have him on board, and we are very sure that with his vast experiences teaching debate to his juniors as well as taking part in different tournaments as a core adjudicator and as also a speaker, there will be a lot of insights to share with different individuals. Manasija, welcome. Do you want to just introduce yourself a bit to the guests?
I guess you have done quite a bit of it. So I'll just say, yeah, it's been around 4 years of what I have been debating for. I joined my DepSoc in my first year, and it took me around 6 months to get used to it. I had no amount of public speaking experience when I was in school, but I wanted to do something of that sort when I joined my college and I heard about DepSoc and had no idea what British parliamentary format looked like. In my school, it used to be 2 minute speeches, and that's pretty much it. And you used to know the topic for like 3 days ago. And when I joined my DepSoc, I learned that it is a platform where you know your topic 15 minutes before you have to just speak, and you have to speak for 7 minutes. So yeah, it's been quite an exciting part of my life. Has a lot of impact of how I am as a person, has impact of my career choices, has impact of what kind of friends I have made. And yeah, I'm like pretty happy about that choice at the end of the day.
I'm pretty sure that VIT has one of the few DepSocs which prioritizes British parliamentary a lot more over Asian parliamentary, and it has a very rich culture in doing well in BP tournaments as well. So it's going to be very insightful for you to speak to us a bit about how your experiences has been on British parliamentary as well, right? But then, if I'm not wrong, VIT people usually associate engineers having different skill sets, and so what made you like choose debating as an activity when you were getting into college?
In terms of British parliamentary, I think one thing which makes VIT debate a lot in terms of British parliament is the north south type of formats which this country follows. So if you go to DU colleges or the northern circuit, you see a lot of 3v3 tournaments. If you go to the southern colleges like Nalsar, or you go to RV or RCL or VIT, for example, you see a lot of British parliamentary colleges. And this has been happening something for 10 to 15 years. Of course, like these things are changing. You see a lot of British parliamentary tournaments in northern circuit now. You see a lot of Asian tournaments in southern circuit now. But yeah, like I think one of the few colleges which do a British parliamentary debating more.
You've had experiences in engineering, right? Because VIT is traditionally
Yeah.
associated with the engineering degree that it holds in its campus, and majorly it's a engineering college. So, what made you like select debating as an activity?
I'll be honest, like most of the people like me didn't choose engineering because they liked engineering. Like it is something which was forced upon by our parents, or something which has been told us, like was told that this is the path you need to follow. But a lot of people like me and the people which I met in VIT DepSoc were people who were just like, I would just say, like, it's, I don't mean it in a bad way, but they were nerds. They were nerds about knowing about literally every single thing which is happening in the world. They wanted to know what is happening in world, like what is Putin doing or what is Trump doing, or like they would talk about like different philosophers, or they will talk about what feminism looks like. So this is a different brand of engineers which just get got directed towards an activity known as debating, because I guess this was the only platform for them to talk about these things in a meaningful way. So like if you go to a random engineering class and you talk about what did Henkel say about something very philosophical, nobody would listen to you. But if you say it in a depth talk, there will be five people arguing against you, and that creates a space where people could just talk about these things. So you meet this like-minded kind of people, or engineers who are just passionate about these things, because I guess engineers are also quite diverse in terms of their interests. So you are always bound to meet this kind of people in spaces like VIT, I guess.
When we're talking about debating and public speaking as a skill, a lot of people just don't understand that it does help across channels, right? Because I'm pretty sure that even an engineer needs to go to an office at the end of the day and talk to his
Right.
boss. And then you
Right.
need to win an argument against somebody at any point of time, or you need to present like a particular slide deck to your competitors,
Hmm.
against your competitors in a marketplace or something. There would need some sort of presentation skills or spoken skills, right? So I think you're hitting the nail on the head, right? Because people do have different interests. Some people are more inclined towards having passion about certain hobbies and certain things, which might lead them to do these activities as well. But moving on to the next part, right? Because Manasija, when we were introducing you, we did discuss that you've had so much rich experience internationally. I'm pretty sure a lot of our viewers and listeners would benefit a lot from this, right? Because they've not had, some of them would be just getting into the world, some of them might be just planning to do the next major international tournament. And of course, being part of a era in which COVID was very predominant in the world, there was a lot more differences in how you're approaching international tournaments then versus now. So, just to start off, Manasija, what would you say moved you towards into moving into these international debate forums? Did you have a particular decision that you had to make at any point of time that, right, this is the step up that I need to do to come into the international circuit?
The one thing is like and as you mentioned, the COVID thing happened and all of these international tournaments moved online for the first time. And and to be very honest, there were only very few Indian teams who did international majors before that. And obviously there's an accessibility issue because a lot of these tournaments happen at obscure part of worlds where Indians just cannot afford it, because a lot of Indian universities are actually quite underfunded, which won't pay for your flights or which won't pay the exorbitant rich fees. So a lot of this when shifted and COVID happened and all of this shifted online, there's just a huge flux of these tournaments happening, and you just didn't know when the next major would happen online because nobody knew when COVID would end. So the first wave happened, and you saw, okay, so Monash Hostels 2020 is happening online for the first time, or the UADC 2020 is happening online for the first time, and you don't know whether the 2021 edition would happen or not. So I think the first thing is that just the excitement that I have done an international major or just trying my hands to it, because I just didn't know if the next major would happen. So I was just in my, I guess, 1 year of debating when I first did my first international tournament, which was Australs 2020. We did quite poorly because like there were obviously better debaters and much experienced debaters. But I think the first thing which I got pulled towards was the excitement towards it. But then COVID obviously got extended, a lot of majors then happened, and you just looked forward to it because of all the YouTube videos you watch and learn from, or all the debaters you watch videos of or take their workshops online. A lot of these debaters were the ones who debated at that international majors, and you wanted to be part of that legacy, or you wanted to face them, or you wanted to get feedback from them, or you wanted to like at least try to like be, I guess, one of the Indians who did well at the majors. So you would prepare for those tournaments and you would go there. And that is why I think the first, like, the as you say, like the key of doing international tournaments is something which you get for the first time, I think. And that is how it happened. So COVID obviously definitely had a bigger role to play in terms of how Indians now see international majors, because now it's not only someone in America who has an international debate achievement, but it's someone in your college or someone in your competitor college or someone you know very closely has gone to an international tournament and you want to do the same. So I think it has opened doors quite some ways to do international tournaments, I feel.
Yeah, the ecosystem got a major boost because people sort of thought, right, my friend is going to do the international tournament. It's best that I also sign up. And at one point of time, a lot of people were doing them. I remember that I think we have also spoken into the same tournament at times, and it was a very interesting experiences, in terms of getting more knowledge and getting the awareness from having these experienced debaters aside with us. But Manasija, the first thing that you mentioned here is that when you were in your like first year of debating, you decided to do the international. So I'm pretty sure that would have been very challenging in the way that you're approaching it, because you said that Australs was an experience where you learned a lot and you developed a lot of what you were missing probably when you were going into it. So what do you think would be the best thing or the best way in which majors could be approached by an Indian team?
First thing is like the reality right now is that COVID is not there anymore. So all of these tournaments are obviously offline. So there are few things I would say like someone has to keep in mind. I think first thing is like the amount of expense which someone has to put, especially someone who is a student in India, is obviously hard to afford because all of these decisions fees are extremely high and there are flight costs to be incurred. So I would say the first thing is that you necessarily need to have a target in your mind. So if you are actually satisfied of participating in the tournament and doing your best, that's the expectation you should have, I think. And if your expectation is that you want to break or you want to go to the quarterfinals, if you are confident that you are going to meet that goal, you should go there. Because at the end of the day, if you are not meeting your own expectation after going to an international major, you are going to be extremely sad about it, because the amount of financial cost you have incurred upon yourself or the amount of time you have missed out on your college is also an extremely large cost. But also, more importantly, there are like time costs associated before the tournament as well. Like if you are going to an international major, you prepare for it, you go to pre-international tournaments, or you attend them online and something else, and you check your performance, you make a matter file, you do mocks with your partner, and you do all of those things. So all of this has a huge amount of investment which needs to be done. So I think the first thing is that someone has to realize the amount of investment which needs to be done, and someone has to have realistic expectations about it as well. And I think the last thing is that there, like even if you are all serious about this stuff, the last thing is that you have to know that debating is an activity which is also extremely unpredictable, like most of the sports are. And debating, I would say, is one of the most unpredictable sport, if it has to be, because you just don't know what kind of emotion you would get, what kind of position you would get, if in 15 minutes you will get the right idea or not. So you'll also need to have an expectation, okay, even if I don't do well, at least I did my best. And I think that's good enough. I think fourthly, and this works only for me, and this is a personal note, like if you're going to Vietnam and Thailand, it's a great country to travel, so you get to travel as well, so you get to have fun there, you like get to see a new place, new culture, new food. So also be excited about that, I guess. So I think all of those things do help.
I'm pretty certain that there are a lot of different nuances that go into preparing for majors as well, right? Because you
Sure.
mentioned that there are a lot of pre-tournaments that you need to go to because you need to practice, and if you don't get into the rhythm, as you said, it's a sport. And if you're not in a good rhythm and if you're not in a good place, it doesn't make sense to go as well because you're not really trained up to go there and do well, and you have to have sort of like these systems where you believe that you will be performing well too. So I think the first piece that I would like to take out from your conversation with me here is that there is a requirement for a particular sustained amount of training, right? So, Manasija, with your experiences in so many tournaments, do you think that there is a particular routine or regimen that has helped you do better, or do you think there is something that you would recommend somebody going into this field taking up for preparing for their first majors or international tournament?
The first thing I would say is like all of these regimes which we talk about, obviously there's a disclaimer that it works for me doesn't mean that it needs to work for you. So like for me, like the way I identified my problems is that I know a lot of stuff, but the way it happens is my structure of my speeches are bad. So what do? I go into a plan where I am able to structure my speeches better. So that looks like giving speeches continuously, doing mocks continuously, doing tournaments continuously, and just focusing on how clean my speeches can be. So I think the first step then has to be identifying your own weaknesses, highlighting those weaknesses, and just looking upon how you can act upon them. So that's one thing. The second thing is, because it's an international tournament, you also need to know what kind of people you're going to face. So it's advisable for you to do online tournaments where you can face these kind of competitors which you are going to face. So when, let's say, you're doing an ABP tournament, which is Asian British Parliamentary, you will see a lot of pre-ABP tournaments happening just like 2 months before the tournament is going to happen, and every weekend would have one of them. And you should do a few of them, because you would not only get the speaking experience, but also you will get feedback from the judges who are probably going to judge in the same tournament as well. But you will also going to face people you're going to face in that tournament as well. It gives you multi-layered sort of approach in terms of like how you are preparing yourself. The last thing is obviously spar, talk to these people. If you can, like have, like, on Facebook is a great platform, like all of these people are connected online, so you do have access to these kind of platforms. Ask, mock, spar, and like do whatever you feel right. And the last thing is like, you are going to make an investment, so be prepared well in terms of how much you can know. So I think read up is something which a lot of people don't do, especially in the Indian circuit. I think it's really advisable that you do. A lot of people who do well in majors internationally have humongous matter files, which in which they have collected a lot of matter. uh, it is something which I think people need to do more, especially in India, they need to read up more, they need to know more, especially the country you're going. So, for example, in the Panama WDC Worlds, which happened right now, I obviously didn't attend, but if people look at the motions, there were at least three motions on South America because it was a tournament happening in South America. Obviously, as an Indian, you would not know what is happening in Panama or what is happening in Cuba or what is happening in Brazil, but you are expected to know because that is where the geographic location of the tournament is. So those kind of knowledge needs to be connected. Those things need to be read. It always gives you an edge if you know more. So I think yeah, these few things is something which you can keep in mind.
Very true. I think the first thing that I wanted to ask you after the um, last question was to discuss a bit about the matter files, as you were hinting, right? Because a
Yeah.
lot of Indian debaters are not really good at making matter files, or for that fact, not even have anything considerate to be called a matter file in the beginning itself, right? Because I think Indian debaters predominantly matter files are not explained to them, and since they do not have an awareness about matter files, they do not really know how to build one properly. So let's just discuss a bit about how these matter files could do good for the novice debater, but also an experienced debater, and how do you set about building one? Because I think you have your own method of doing it. A lot of people will have their own method of doing it. So could you just walk us through some of your tidbits about what is the best practices that can be assumed, or what are the other things that we can sort of look at in terms of building a good matter file?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that I actually do not recommend a novice debaters to start matter filing from the get go, because I think what happens is that once they have noted on everything in a matter file, they think that okay, the matter is there, I'll just read it out and it will work. It doesn't, because the matter file just tells you what is true or what is happening. You have to make arguments from it and derive arguments from it, and I think that requires a nuanced understanding which comes with slight of bit of experience. So I think this matter file thing works for a lot of intermediate to expert debaters. But what you can start with is the idea of what works for you. Obviously, you also mentioned that personally these things matter. And the first thing is like I've seen matter files which are 10 pages long, and I've seen matter files which are 1,000 pages long. And both of these matter files belong to two different world champions. So the thing which matters, I would say, is uh, see what works for you. So for me, a lot of things worked is that I noted on a lot of stock arguments I make, which one argument works for all kind of things, right? So why environmental movements are good to be working with companies is an argument I can make a lot of times in a lot of debates. So I would just note down five things I already know about it. Or secondly, I would note down about the countries I'm going to. So for example, when we are going to Vietnam, we had 20 pages on Vietnam about different sectors, and that is what we wanted to carry is forward because we don't know what kind of emotion about Vietnam would come up with. So I think that's a good start. The third thing is that you can also note down things and note down arguments from debates you like and your arguments you make in your own speech, so that when 15 minutes prep time comes up, you don't have to rewrite your arguments or rethink your arguments or recall what you wanted to say, but rather you already have it in your matter file. So I think these are multiple ways you can make a matter file. But I think it's one thing to make a matter file, and the second thing is that to know your matter file. So one should, I think, know their matter file most importantly, because if you have just noted on everything and you don't know where the stuff is, or you have no nuanced understanding of okay, how does this stuff plays out, and you have not read your own matter file, then it doesn't work anymore because you need to derive arguments from the matter you already have. So I would say these are the few things one could keep in mind in terms of matter file. Yeah.
Matter in and of itself is constantly evolving too, because if you look at, say, the situation in America, the presidency changing changes a lot of different contexts around the presidency. And so even motions set around, say, the Ukraine conflict, or the conflict in, say, Israel, all of these things would have a different perspective, and the presidency also has changed because Trump has a different dilemma to deal with, and Trump has a different approach to dealing with these things, say, compared to Joe Biden, in terms of the way that the Americas are approaching these issues. So I think there are a lot of different aspects that you also mentioned is considerate in terms of the way that we are approaching different subjects and different matters. And it's very important that we understand the nuance between what is actually written as a guide versus what we're actually presenting as an argument, because people
Right.
usually don't have that bridging done between them. Just moving to the next part then. So I think we discuss a lot about different formats as well, and your experiences in different formats. Do you think there are substantial trade-offs by approaching one thing, or should we, as a debater, when we are going into, say, tournaments, approach all formats equally, or do you think there are some benefits to doing some formats, or there are some differences which you have to be very clear about and then decide which formats to approach?
I would say, like, at the end of the day, debating is a sport which is just fun. I would not tell anyone to do one format over the other. Like, do all formats. Like, all formats have their own ways of being fun. And then people obviously have the formats they really like or not. So maybe I like British parliamentary more, but I equally enjoy Asians debating. And these are two very different things. And I would say, like, obviously, the basics of each is that you have to make a good argument. You have to do the basics of the argumentation well. You have to give enough impacts. You have to substantiate them well. You have to weigh those impacts. And these things are true across all formats, and none of these things change. Sure, like, there are some dynamic changes. So, for example, I would say a British parliamentary debate format is slightly harder than an Asian format because there are a lot of more dynamics to play in British format because there are four teams instead of just one, instead of just two who are in a debate room. So you have to think of what a good extension is. You have to think about how do you place your extension, and these are multiple more additional things. So these things also play out, and you obviously need extra practice for that. But I would obviously encourage everyone to, like, try all formats rather than just sticking to one, because I think if you are more dynamic in BP, it also helps you in Asians because it allows you to pivot better in a debate. And there are more and more transferable skills in all formats, I would say. So that's pretty much it. Like, I don't think people have to stick to one format to be good in debating. I think they can just play around and have fun.
The reason why we sort of have the skepticism about different formats is that we've not explored them as much as we could have, right?
Yeah.
That's why I was also asking you what was your perspective on these issues. Let's just think about it from, say, another angle, because we've spoken so much about, say, being a speaker in these tournaments, but you're also a very good judge, and you've also judged a lot of tournaments and also scored a lot of different tournaments to my best of my knowledge. So let's just change the game around a bit. Let's just discuss in this next segment about how to become a better judge as well. So, what made you start out as a judge, and do you think that there are certain things you had to trade off as a speaker when you were starting off as a judge?
So, to be very honest, like, there are multiple ways in which people start. Like, there are a lot of people who start out as a judge, then pivot towards a speaker, or there are just people who just don't speak. There are just judges, and then there are people who obviously speak first and judge later. I was the later, right? So I spoke a lot, then I started to pivot towards judging. I think the first thing is that the reason why I judged is because the first idea when I started judging was I needed a break from speaking. So I was speaking every singular weekend. Obviously, it was COVID and I was at home and I was bored and everything. All of those added up. But I wanted to judge because I wanted to see what's out there. And the one thing that I learned after judging, after, like, not being a huge fan of it, because that's not something which I did in the initial time, is that judging actually makes you a better speaker. I think the reason for this is, like, in judging, when you are trying to judge between two different teams, and obviously you have to give an oral adjudication to justify why you have given a win over one team over the other, you find holes and gaps in argumentations which allow you to justify why one team won over the other. While identifying those, you also realize what kind of mistakes you, as personally as a speaker, are also making while you are speaking. So more often than not, you will see gaps which you yourself would have made, or you see debate from a lens or a third eye perspective in which you understand, okay, how does a judge think, and I can make it far more convincing. Because at its core, debating is a activity of persuasion, right? So if the judge is not persuaded, however cool your accent or argument or anything else, it doesn't matter if the judge is not convinced, because at the end of the day, it's the activity of persuasion. And when you are the judge, you know what works and what doesn't. And I think that's a extremely important skill to have as a speaker as well. So I think judging and speaking does play out in those fashion. So yeah, I think I would recommend everyone to judge at least a few times so that they become a better speaker if they only want to speak, if that is.
I think there's a lot of dichotomy that exists between a speaker and a judge as well, right? Because speakers are very like, judges are always wrong. Sometimes they don't hear my arguments
Yeah.
properly, and they do have these sort of like conflicts with judges, and judges have similar conflicts with speakers. Like, you've not really reasoned out your argument. So I think everybody does a whole lot better when they understand the other side, because
Yeah.
at the end of the day, if you don't appease the judge, as you mentioned, if you don't persuade them, you don't really hold a chance of winning, because your arguments need to be persuasive to win over the judge at the end of the day. So it's best to have, say, both worlds explored. But then when you started out judging, I think this would have been a very important factor for you also to understand the different balances between a speaker and a judge. And you
Hmm.
experienced that, and I think that was also something that you spoke so highly about the importance of. But let's just see a couple of other nuances here, right? Because as a judge, you will also need to have a different set of skills. So do you think that there are some relevant things that you need to focus more on as a judge rather than a speaker? For example, as a judge, for me, I think being more intent in my listening capacity and being more like careful about not missing out content became much more of a priority than when I was a speaker. So do you think there are some technical skill sets that you need to sort of evolve into when you're going into becoming a judge?
Judging is 100% a far more taxing activity mentally and physically than a speaker, because a speaker speaks for 7 minutes and they sit. A judge has to listen for the whole debate for an hour. And while sitting for an hour, it's just like you have to sit at one place and you have to listen. So it's not only like tiring because you are listening to a lot of people, but also like mentally you are thinking all the time in that 1 hour. So I think one, you have to be technically adapted to listening for a long time, and you have to be adaptive to the idea that people are going to speak. The second thing is, I think judges, what it also means that I think your idea of how to make smart note making is something which is highly underrated, because you can go around and note everything a speaker is saying, but you will get lost in words quite quickly. So you need to know what is important and what is not. And grasping that quality as a judge is also, I think, really, really important. Like the idea of tracking the debate really comes into play, especially as a judge. Like obviously there are speakers who need to do this, especially as a whip speaker, but as a judge you need to track the whole debate quite accurately. And that only comes from practice, I would say, because it's not easy to track the whole debate. You need to identify all the moving spaces which are happening in different debates, and you have to connect those moving pieces to different parts. You have to use one part as a rebuttal, you have to use one part as a rebuilding of the case, and so on. So all of those things are important skills, I would say, a judge needs to have. And the last thing is that at the end of the day there's only one winner. So you have to be extremely convincing as a judge for the team who loses or why they lost, because it's very easy for them to be dismissive, it's very easy for them to be sad. So you have to make them understand and persuade them of why they lost. That idea of persuasion, which is also a debater needs, I think is also far strongly required as a judge. So I think these three things is something I think a judge needs to have.
When the judge needs to have, say, a different dynamic skill set from a speaker, so transitioning between a speaker and a judge becomes that more challenging because you don't really have that mental awareness at the beginning, but you get more experience as you go on with it. So let's just have a highlight of your journey, right? Because we know that since you started judging, you then became a core and you've done a lot of tournaments as a core. You've become an invited judge also in many tournaments. Could you just run us through the process as to what shift you needed to make to come to, say, becoming an invited edge? What shifts happened for you to become a core, and then what essentially went on play by play?
You need to have achievements to become an invited adjudicator and core, and all of this requires hard work. So I don't think you can just wake up one day and decide to be an invited adjudicator, or you get invited as an adjudicator, or you get invited as a core adjudicator. You need to do the hard work and the grunt work of becoming good at what you do. It could be anything like debating or judging and so on. I think the first thing people need to identify as to become an invited adjudicator and a core adjudicator, I feel, is people need to know that only speaking is not an indicator of how good you are as a judge, because as we previously discussed, there are skills which a judge particularly requires, which doesn't automatically come to you as a speaker. So you need to be identified as a good judge as well, for people to also identify to be you to be an invited speaker, invited adjudicator. And similarly goes for core, right? So I think the first level is invited adjudicator, and then you start becoming a core. The second thing is, like, obviously there is like people need to recognize you as someone who could be a code adjudicator, because obviously there are tournaments which, what do tournaments need? Tournament wants their code adjudicators to be good because they want their motions to be great, or the code adjudicators to pull people in so that they would be like, hey, this guy is code adjudicator, I want to be in this tournament because I will get good feedback or I will get good motions. So you need to also be recognized as someone who is good, and that only happens if you are active in the debating circuit. You are speaking regularly, you are winning regularly, you are you're getting laurels regularly, people respect you as a speaker. And obviously there are also interpersonal skills, because at the end of the day a core adjudicator is someone who has to play multiple moving parts. They have to deal with the tabby cat, they have to deal with the equity team, they have to deal with the OC team. So people who are not nice are also not also people who get lesser core adjudicator gigs, because if you're not a nice person, nobody wants to work with you. There are other core adjudicators who would not want to work with you. There are OCs who do not want to work with you. So people who are nice to others are also the people who get Rui core adjudicator more, because they have to interact with a lot of these people. They have to talk to a lot of these people. So be nice, give people feedback, don't be mean to people is also, I think, is a very important quality which goes unnoticed in in a good core adjudicator, I feel.
When we're discussing about core judges as well, I think there are certain things which cores do very differently from, say, judges who are, say, IAs, or who are, say, just judges in the tournament, or independent judges, or institutional judges. What kind of specific things do you think a cap needs to have so that they are classified as somebody who's good and have the particular necessary skill sets to perform better? And with your experience also, I think you mentioned a couple of things, right? They need to be well acquainted with people dynamics. They need to be good with, say, the equity, the OC, and other individuals. What else do you think would factor into becoming, say, a good core, so that people who are going into this would know?
I think the first obvious thing is that the code adjudicator needs to know this activity well, right? So everything related to this activity, first, I think the technicalities of how motions are made is really important, because if the motion is bad, by bad motion, don't mean that something you don't know, but rather something which is imbalanced, or something which is hard to debate upon or hard to understand, or has an accessibility issue towards it which is not supposed to be there, is something they need to understand really well. For a tournament to work really well, it has to be extremely fair, and the fairness comes from the kind of motions which are made. So I think the first thing is that they need to know the technicalities well. They need to know the manual really well, to know different kinds of motions and what is should be the adequate burdens which requires this motion for teams to be taken upon. And all of those things need to be taken care of as a core adjudicator, and you need to have a clear understanding of these things. The second thing is, I think they also have to be, as you mentioned, they have to be someone who understands people dynamics better. I think I talked about this in the previous answer. But I think the last thing is they have to be good in management as well, because tournaments are a hectic activity, right? So they start at a correct time. The rounds need to happen at the right time. You need to make quick decisions. You need to you have to run the tournament in a particular way where it starts well and ends well. So you need to have good managerial skills as well. And lastly, I would say that you need to understand judge allocs, right? This is again a technicality. So judge allocations are basically the one judge, like who should judge which room, is something which you need to know, right? So there are different kind of judges which you have. You have your own code adjudicators who adjudicate. You have invited adjudicators which are experienced. You have judges which are competing. You have subsidized adjudicators. So there are different judges at different levels of skill sets, and also there's the factor of how they're performing at that particular tournament. So you have to be extremely smart in terms of what kind of allocations you do, and if the allocations are fair, and if the allocations are like also meet a certain criterias like diversity and so on. So all of those things need to be taken care of on, and you need to be extremely cognizant of these things. And I think these things are really important for a code adjudicator to know.
But yeah, I mean, you do mention a couple of interesting things, like, because we discuss, say, balancing motions, and we discuss judge allocations. I like to focus on these two things next. Like, let's just talk about motion balancing first. What do you think goes into motion balancing? Because it's a discussion that we have had so much, but then it would be great to have new perspectives as well, right? Because balancing motions isn't really taught that well in, say, circuits, or maybe even in coaching or other places, but therefore it's more important that these perspectives are shared. So what do you think goes behind balancing a motion and making a good motion? Like, let's just walk through that process.
First thing is, like, I think you pointed out an interesting thing, that this is not something which is taught. I think it should be, because I think there are two things here. One, I think it allows core adjudicators to be better and to understand how motions are meant to be balanced. The second thing, it increases accessibility of new people and up and coming debaters who can be core adjudicators, because obviously they don't know this as well, and this information is not extremely accessible. If it is, there are more and more people who can get more core adjudicator gigs. But after, even if saying that, I think one thing it goes into core adjudicators making balance motion is that you check the balance by allowing other core adjudicators to put down arguments, and then you go into a discussion between core adjudicators and to realize if the balance of the motion is right. So there are few basic checks. One, the amount of burden which both sides need to take needs to be adequately equal. So, like for example, like just a very standard example, like you can't expect one team to prove like why one stakeholder is going to be good, the second team needs to prove why global peace would happen. So these are two extremely unbalanced burdens which you are placing on two different teams. So the balances need to be right in terms of the burdens you are placing. Secondly, there need to be convincing number of arguments which exist on both sides. It can't be that one side has one good argument and the other side has 10 different good arguments. That means that you are reaching towards an unbalanced motion. The way you reach to this conclusion of what a burden should be or what the arguments are is something which the core educators discuss among themselves. It's either a discussion or something which they write upon in a sheet or something, and this gets discussed upon later. And that is how you essentially check the balance of emotion. I think that's the most fair, and I think I've seen a few tournaments where you also like if you nothing is working out, you just place if you have five adjudicators, one becomes a judge and two become two different teams, and you make a debate happen, and you realize if the motion is balanced or not. I think it happens rarely, but I've seen that happen. But I think at the end of the day, it just between the five core adjudicators who decide what the balance motions are, and that is why it is important to have you to know your qualities and you to be good at what you're doing to have these balance motions. Otherwise, you would not get if most of the core adjudicators are unable to understand if the balance is right or not. So I think that is why those skills are important to be developed.
Subjectively does play sort of like a factor in that, because lot of people, when they are exchanging ideas, they get more idea about what their biases might be or what they're objectively at fault at in the motion, because you might make a motion but then you might not immediately recognize that it's balanced or imbalanced. So the having a cap panel or a core panel, as you say, is much more beneficial in terms of say these kind of activities, right? Because you have sort of like a discussion and sort of have exchange of
Right.
ideas.
More importantly, I feel diversity in a core panel because you mentioned that there are multiple viewpoints which need to be incurred. So diversity, for example, people coming from different circuits, people of different kind of different gender minorities and so on, allows you to have different perspectives to know the balance of emotion.
The last part that would have come around from say balancing emotion, and you mentioned diversity as an important factor. There are a lot of different nuances that you need to take in, right? The inherent biases of in the motion or of the people who are doing the motion. So for example, Indians might have a certain bias towards certain things. There might be certain other things that you need to be taking into care. But I think that's a very interesting perspective that you share with us, Manasija, because a lot needs to be discussed in this domain. Just hinting towards say one thing that you mentioned in your last answer, you say that having more diverse people would affect people positively. So I think that's also something that we need to have sort of like a discussion on. Do you think that diversity does well for cores being in a panel, or do you think that there are certain ways in which it can be showed up? Because of course in certain places there have not been enough diversity and we need sort of like transitioning to say having better conversations about these places. So do you think there are certain mechanisms where we can do better in these fields?
First thing is, I think it definitely helps. The reason is that I think diversity not only in terms of how you identify as a person or what kind of circuit you belong, but I genuinely think it matters of what kind of fields you are studying and what kind of jobs you are doing. Like if I am an analyst in Bain, I would probably know more about businesses. I would probably know a lot about engineering because that is my background, but I might not know enough about law, and that doesn't allow me to make extremely new missions about law if I'm not passionate about studying it on my own. So a law student is much more privy to it because it is probably taught something to them, right? So I think diversity in terms of that is also really important. I think people should factor that more in terms of how they're making panels. In terms of diversity, in terms of circuit or how you identify in your terms of your gender and so on, I think the circuit has gone towards a positive stride towards it, because there's something which I've observed from my first year of debating to till now. I have seen far more number of core adjudicators which are part of the gender minority communities, and this is something which has driven towards a change. And I think it has also encouraged more and more judges to come up which are not cishet male, and this is something which is extremely interesting to see. Sure, we can take more and more amount of positive strides towards it and encourage more and more number of debaters. Uh, but I think we are going in the right direction and we should continue to do so.
One other very important discussion that was sort of possible from that conversation is that when we discuss, say, judge allocations as a practice, I think even that is not that well explored. So people don't really know how to allocate judges. It's like a traditional art form which you pass on or something of that end. Do you think you can have like sort of differences in terms of judge allocations, and what essentially are the fundamental things that you need to take into account when you're focusing on allocating judges in tournaments?
Right. So I think there are a lot of moving pieces in terms of what comes down to judge allocations, but I think the pure fundamental would be you have to recognize that a part of your tournament is where all rooms are equally important, and there is a part of tournament where there are only some rooms which are far more important than the others. So when the rooms are equally important, a fair code adjudicator is someone who is extremely agnostic to the idea of who is debating in what room. So they don't know which team they are. They don't know what kind of teams are part of that room. They should allocate judges randomly if their scores are same. So if there are five judges which are at score seven, you should not care about what kind of rooms they're getting into if that room requires a 7 point judge. So they should be allocated randomly. Is something which creates an extremely fair call in terms of adjudication. The second thing, obviously, is that when rooms become tighter and tighter, obviously there are rooms just before the break round, just before the break, where the rooms determine who is going to qualify and who is going to not. There are rooms which, on unfortunately, have no teams which can qualify anymore, and there are rooms in which all teams are going to qualify. So you prioritize good judges in the rooms which allow more, and in which there are teams which have a lot in stake in terms of if they win they go through, if they lose they are out. And secondly, you then prioritize teams where it determines where they exactly break. So if they win they qualify first, or if they lose they qualify eighth. That's where the second priority rooms are. And third priority obviously are the rooms where where there's not much in terms of stakes. So there's something which you have to be extremely aware about, and this creates the most amount of fair adjudicators, because like this allows for the best teams to go through for the knockouts.
That entire perspective shed a lot of light into say how cores operate in tournaments as well. So just moving on to a couple of final few segments here. When we are talking about novices in tournaments, of course novices don't have say access to information and access to say a lot of these things that we're discussing right now. What would be some things that you would advise somebody who's just getting into the circuits that they belong to about debating, and what would be your first few steps guiding them?
I think the first thing which needs to be told to them is that debate, like you, I think there are two sides of debating. One is an extremely serious competitive nature of which it happens in the debate rooms, and there is one extremely fun side of it where you are discussing ideas, you are making a cool argument, you are making new friends, you are having fun with them at the end of the day. I think both of these things need to be made aware to people, because I think what attracts people towards debating is also the intellectual exchange which happens in the room, and there's something which they discuss upon. So that needs to be get aware, but you also have to remind them that at the end of the day, this is, for most people this is an hobby, or most people this is something which they do for fun. Most people this is an extracurricular activity which they really like, and this is something which you, obviously your life doesn't depend on it, and this both of the things need to be equally balanced in terms of how you are guiding a novice. So I think that is really important, because it tells them that this is a activity which is serious and it comes down to it, because you are making arguments about extremely pertinent issues. But at the end of the day, if you lose a round, it's okay, and you can move on and do better next time. So I think that's the first thing which needs to be taught to debate, like to novices, like even before teaching them debating 101, or what is an argument, or what is a judge, or what is an impact, or what is a mechanism. Because knowing this from right from the get-go is the only way where you have longevity in terms of debaters. Otherwise, either they get too exhausted, or they just don't have, like, just give up too easily, or they think it is stressful. So I think that's the first thing I would tell a novice.
when novices are approaching tournament structures, it might become very intimidating because at times people are very confused, because it's sometimes when you go up against a very competitive debater, they're very adamant about doing this very seriously, and then that might scare certain individuals. So there are a lot of moving parts that need to be considered when there are discussions happening on this end, right? Because novices need a lot more handholding, possibly because there have been a lot of issues where people just wash out of the system because they're not really very aware about how to improve. Maybe they're very stuck up in terms of being not that competitive from the get-go, and maybe that might become scary for them. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, Manasija. When we have these novices, there needs to be certain sort of trade-offs that we need to give them, and there are also certain sort of discussions that we need to have with them to ensure that their world is not completely hazed out in terms of debating an activity, right? But let's just discuss a bit more in terms of certain benefits that networking does, because I think when we discuss networking, it's good to have sort of like a structure, because when you say that debating is an intellectual activity, as you did before, there's a lot of intellectual discussions happening which stimulate you as a person, right? Because if this stimulates you as a person, you're more likely to continue doing this activity, and that might help a lot of novices. But then networking and then maintaining these friendships also play a key part, because for me personally, I think there's also a way in which if you're not visible, you're not really seen, and if you're not really seen, you won't really get the opportunity to do better. And this applies to other places like even an IA or a SA or a good speaker or a good debater or a good coach, because as you mentioned, because there is a lot more importance of knowing somebody being good enough for that activity for them to actually be given that chance or that role to do that activity, right? So let's just discuss a bit about network effects and how networking also becomes a key part of debating tournaments and debating circuits. Do you think that it is somewhat beneficial for people to do so, or do you think that there's not really any like sort of correlation between networking and say doing better in these situations?
I think networking has a few benefits. I think the first benefit is obviously that you make good friends. I think that's the most important benefit I feel, that you have people which you like know for a long amount of time. You get to gain new perspectives and so on. And at the end of the day, a lot of people you meet in debating are also extremely like-minded people. So they probably are doing the same things in terms of career paths and so on. So it allows you to know really well. Too, I think it really helps you to know, like, if I'm friends with a good debater, and if I get to learn a lot from them, that's good for me because that's an additional skill set I have now. So in terms of transferable skills, I think it really helps in terms of you being an extremely good debater because you are able to help each other out. And these are people who are different part of circuits and so on, which allows you to also help. And the third thing is, and this is quite crucial, is that you also need networking for getting recognition, because unfortunately how it happens is that you to be an invited adjudicator, the first invited or the few first invited adjudicator gigs or few first core gigs, people need to trust you to be good at that activity, because as we previously discussed, you being a core adjudicator is an extremely important task and extremely hard task at it, and people need to know that you can do the task really well. So you need someone to tell that, hey, I know this guy and he's supposed to be good at it, so we can give him a chance. And I think that that first thing really allows you to keep through and move slightly ahead. So the people who network a lot, for them this comes easier. The people who network really less, this comes a bit harder. But I think the more thing which gives, like, which is okay in debating is that if you are good enough, you will get that opportunity. It might take a bit more time for rather than the people who are networked too much, but it will come through, because if you have the achievements and if you have the credentials, you will make enough people, will make enough friends. You will be like, you would have given feedback to a junior of a depsoc, and when they organize their tournament, they'll be like, hey, this guy was really good and we want them in our tournament. And that will happen quite sooner than you think. So yeah, networking does have its benefits, but it is not something which like really decides your debating career, is I would say.
When you say that, the first phrase that comes to mind is if you're young enough, it doesn't matter. If you're good enough, you're old enough. And if you're well enough, you're going to get the gig regardless, right? So I think that's an interesting perspective as well, because I think people do have this confusion and this sort of lack of determination, if you might say, so that they cannot really approach those levels. They just need to be a bit more patient, possibly, as you were saying, Manasija, and then that opportunity will open up for them. So let's just go into the fun part of this last segment. And Let's just talk a bit about, say, for example, your interesting tidbits from your debating journey. So, if we were to ask you what were your best experiences, or maybe your most memorable moments from debating, what would they be?
I think I have two. So the first thing is winning Nalsar IB in 2019, if I'm not wrong. No, sorry, not 2019, 2023, 2022, sorry. So the reason for that is that Nalsar is a tournament which is like quite widely known in India, and it is something which every debater has heard about. And this is also the first debate video I ever watched. And before Nalsar, I was prepping for my placements. I was giving different exams. So I had not debated for 8 months. And I just went to the tournament and it worked out really well. And we won that tournament and it was quite fun. And the person who won that tournament also like just texted in 2016, the first video I ever watched, also texted me that day. And it was obviously an extremely wholesome experience and like quite fun, I would say. The second is that with something which happened recently, like in Krabi Asian British Parliamentary, where we were able to reach semi-finalists. I think there were a few things which were fun. Like one, I was with friends, and all of us were extremely stressed about each round and us getting through first through pre-quarters, then quarters, and getting breaks first, and just us standing in a group. And it was in a hotel room. We were standing beside the pool, and the breaks were getting announced or the results were getting announced, and all of this extremely stressed, just walking around randomly, round, just around the pool, just waiting for everything, and like the adrenaline was really high, and that was something I was missing for a quite a lot of time, and it was quite fun to reach the semifinals, which I thought I would never do when I started debating, but I did, and all of those were fun. I think all of these two tournaments have very fun experience, not only because of the debating part, but how all of this played out. Like the most closest friends I have made in debating circuit were the ones in Nalsar in one particular round where none of us knew how it went and none of us knew where we'd be first, second, or third, or fourth. But all of us just talked there for the first time. Like we have seen each other in like different boxes in a Zoom call in online debating, but none of us had interacted before, and we started doing that. And those are one of the closest friends I have in the debating circuit now. So those are quite memorable things which I like took forward and were quite fun. Yeah.
Just gives you a sense of nostalgia as well, right? When you remember the tournaments. Let's just wrap up with the last question for you. So, I'm pretty sure that Manasija, you're planning something again in debating. So, what next for Manasija, and where can we reach out to you?
After obviously the APP semifinals, I don't think I will be speaking quite a lot, but I'm looking forward to adjudicating quite a bit. So I am looking forward to be like getting invited to different tournaments and going to adjudicate there. Maybe if I get invited to core adjudicators here and there, because I think it's important to give back to the community which has given you a lot. And I think adjudicating right now is a good way to do that because I able to add new faces and new novices which come in the circuit and give them enough feedback and also meet my friends on the way. So I think that's a fun experience. I might speak a bit. Sometimes I do that with my juniors in VIT DevSoc in my ex college, and only do that because I wanted to speak with them and hopefully they learn something from me and hopefully we just have fun together. So for me, so all of those things, yeah, you can see me doing all of those things, yeah.
Perfect. I'm very glad to have you on board, Manasij. It was a very nice episode. We discussed a lot of interesting domains about judging. We discussed a lot of interesting perspectives about majors and international tournaments. And I'm pretty sure everybody listening in will have something to take away. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.